me and our strength and conditioning coach did some testing. Turned out that the power from my arms is equal to the power from my legs.
I'd love to know more about how do you get enough protein in?
I mean, it's super crazy and also something we don't really understand, I would say. A bigger challenge is that I have ulcerative colitis, which is a kind of like IBD.
What's that like psychologically to prepare for something so in depth for 4 years?
I think it was even worse for me because of my finger injury. I had spent so long convincing myself that I didn't have an injury and learning to retrust my body and my mind after kind of doing like psychological warfare was pretty challenging.
All right, Jesse, welcome to the podcast, man. I'm so excited for this one. Definitely, man. And, I got to start with the craziest thing, which is I heard from your teammate you don't actually lift weights and that you've never been under a barbell. I'd love to hear, is that true? Do you think climbers should lift weights? I mean, you've always obviously been doing something right because you're so freaking good at climbing, but I'd love to hear about lifting and climbing.
Yeah, you must have been talking to the wrong teammate, unfortunately. I have been lifting the last 2 years or so. It mainly occurs in my winter season. So basically we have an off season where we're not competing as much. And I like to kind of push more in that season. I do think that this year I kind of let that bleed into my competition season as I was approaching the Olympics, which happened in August. But overall, I like to kind of consolidate it to around the winter months when I'm just trying to bulk up, I guess, before the
That makes sense. That makes sense. I'm really curious. What does your coach think of that? Is that something that your coaches want you to do? Lift weights? Is it something that a lot of your teammates do, or is that something very individual?
I think it's something that we don't really understand. Climbing is such a new sport that there's no real science behind it. So it kind of is just what works best for your body and what feels the best. Some of my coaches think that I shouldn't do very much. Some of my coaches are go all in on this. You're super weak compared to other athletes. So it's really important to build up that strength. I think that somewhere in between, of course, is where I probably would settle. So a little bit of moderation. So I think it's nice to do a little bit. It makes me feel stronger, but it makes me so tired as someone who hasn't really lifted that much that I think it's nice for me to be able to, not keep pushing weight for 4 or 5 times a week.
I love the idea of everything in moderation. I'm curious, what do you feel like you get out of it?
I think that there are moves in climbing that are super compression based or honestly just very bicep intensive, or in modern comp climbing there's a lot of coordination and jumps, and my legs are like chicken legs. I think that they're definitely some of the smallest parts of my body. A fun fact is that me and our strength and conditioning coach did some testing this last year, and it turned out that the power from my arms is equal to the power from my legs before I did any lifting. And I think that's probably a little rare to see in most humans. So I think that any strength that I could gain in my leg muscles would really help in those coordination moves and those big jumps that were being required in competition these days.
That's incredible, man. I feel like having most of your strength in the upper body is probably a great gift to a beginner climber who doesn't necessarily know how to use their lower body much. But what I see a lot with people, both in the sport of CrossFit and in climbing, is I see beginners, struggle with grip strength. Mm. And in the sport of CrossFit, where, that's my stomping ground, a lot of people ask me my grip strength feels really weak when I'm moving a barbell or when I'm doing pull-ups. What can I do to train my grip strength to get stronger? And my advice is continue to move barbells and do pull-ups. Your grip strength will get stronger doing the things that you notice it's weak on. Is that similar to rock climbing, or is there something in particular that you would recommend people do to improve grip strength? Or is it just that climbing is enough?
Yeah, I think that honestly, when you're just starting out and even up to an intermediate level, just climbing and getting variety on different hold types and hold sizes is all that you really need to do to improve grip strength over time. And I think a common misconception with climbing is also that it's all in the arms. And even though I just said that kind of my arms and legs are kind of a similar power output, I think for most beginners, the truth is that it's a lot more based in the legs because you're on not the most overhung walls ever. And it's a new experience. So you're naturally going to be a lot more tense on your arms because you're holding on because you're scared that you're going to fall and you're going to hurt yourself. So I think it's really important that for beginners to kind of be able to settle into positions and not overly use their arms in the beginning. I think that's the best way to kind of improve. And then the grip strength piece will also come into play the more that you climb.
100%. That makes a lot of sense. And just to push back a little bit on some of the stuff we earlier said, so you don't lift much, or you do lift, and over the past 2 years now, it's started to become something more into your regimen from some of your coaches, and some of your coaches think otherwise, and you're finding that moderation point. Now, I'm curious, what is some movements that you do in the gym that you think really translate well to your training?
Yeah, I think that it's a couple different moves. Squats for me was a big one. Like, I just feel like I didn't have, so say we're trying to do like a jump move where I'm in 2 undercling holds and I'm in this like tight ball and I need to jump really far, catch another hold and then like throw to another hold. So that obviously requires a lot of different muscles at play. But that idea of like being able to thrust into the wall and really project myself up and over my feet is something that I think getting a lot more like leg muscle really helped with. Just as far as like my vertical jump, my power output for my legs, that was something I was really trying to improve. And I think that over the course of like the 6 months or so that I focused on lifting, I think I really did see that progress and that improvement over time. In climbing, like those were moves that were fairly new to me. So being able to have like an additional stimulus at play to help me learn those moves was super helpful.
Interesting. It makes a lot of sense. I love how you said train legs there, because the more I go around a climbing gym and the more we chat with each other, everyone's talking about how they want to make their legs even smaller. So, and I think that's kind of been there for a long time in climbing, but I love how you're talking about getting stronger with your legs, because coming from a lifting background, I know that having and training your legs a little bit is important, although it may not be like something that's failing every single time, you're on the wall. It is something that is important to train, just like you said. And that's something that's really unorthodox now in a normal gym. I'm really curious, where I see most people get stuck at a regular bouldering gym is somewhere around like the V4, V5 range. It's, where the climbs are just getting to that point where you need skill, you need technique, you need the strength, right? And you're not in a beginner's game anymore, and you really have to start dialing in. You're starting to have to get a little better there. I'm curious, could you give advice to people who are stuck at that like V4, V5 range? Do you happen to see any patterns that, you think you could point out and say, hey, okay, this is how we get better and past that range?
Yeah, I think it's really common to have plateaus and like have those periods in climbing. So I wouldn't get discouraged. Like if say you've been at a V4 or V5 grade for the past like few months or even a year or so. I think that for me, like it's similar to lifting, like you're always trying to think about increasing like intensity or increasing volume. And I think that whatever you feel like you have the time to do, it's important to, push yourself in that way if you want to get better. For me, like I think that intensity is one that probably is hard to do in climbing. I like to think about it as how much someone can fail on the wall. So how many times can you fall on a climb and still be comfortable being in the gym, trying these climbs, moving around to will you like stop trying it and move on? And I think that that focus and that sort of dedication and not feeling embarrassed about like just trying one climb over and over again and never doing it, and trying to focus on like the lessons that you can learn from each of those attempts is way more important than like sending your next hardest grade. So I think we all have those like weaknesses where maybe there was a V3 if you're a V4 V5 climber that you're really struggling on, and I think it's really important to like not be like, okay, that was a V3, like it's like beneath me, and not respect the climb. It's important to go back and like try this climb that maybe was giving you a challenge no matter what the grade is. And I think that that's something that maybe climbers who are in a plateau or who haven't seen many gains could do more of.
Definitely. That makes a lot of sense. And something I'm really curious about is, when you approach any type of lifting, the variables that you're controlling are a lot less than climbing, right? So you could increase the weight, you could change the type of equipment, right? But what's so interesting about climbing is not only do you have all of the variables of you're coming into the climb, you could be tired, you could have had a good day, you could be sore, there's all of that, but the actual problems are very dependent on somebody else's set, right? it kind of reminds me a little bit of like surfing too, where you never really know the wave you're getting. It could be something different, could be a different type of year, depends where you're surfing. I would love to hear your thoughts on how important is setting at the upper Olympic level and the beginner level. How do you think about, progressively training as, the actual sets are a little bit person dependent?
I think that's something that makes climbing special. It's never the same, especially in competition. Like, we're never given the same climb again. We're never given the same route again. I think that that's something that is challenging too. It's like very mentally taxing to have no idea what you're going to get and having to figure out like that mental and like mental puzzle on the wall and before you get on at all. I think that that goes back to like what I kind of just said before, where the grades really don't matter as much, especially like in those beginning stages. It's about finding moves that challenge you and push you, and finding moves that you can like learn from, more so than like, yeah, oh, I did a V4, but I haven't, and I've done a ton of those before, or pushing into the next grade. I think it's really motivating, and I think it's helpful, and I don't think people should fully ignore it. But I think that if you really want to get better at climbing, there's definitely like a deeper understanding to the sport that I think is more important to like strive for. But yeah, setting is definitely something that has definitely been changing like in the past few years, and we just talked about like an example of how coordination and bigger jumps are becoming more common in competition climbing. And that has been frustrating for me for sure in the past. So I guess what I'd also follow that up with is just that for me, it's really important to both find my strengths in the sport. So finding things that I feel like I can progress in and be pretty good at. And then also finding those things like the big jumps that I've got a weak at that I want to improve in. And I think kind of like knowing yourself and finding that balance between things that you're good at and make you feel confident and successful in a day, and also things that you can like learn from and fail on, is really important.
Again, with a really cool example of balance. When you're working on something at such a high level, you have to enjoy the act of doing it, not just beat yourself down with the weaknesses all the time.
Yeah, I guess this podcast is going to be called Moderation.
For sure, man. I've heard you guys talk a lot about weightlifting and just climbing training in general. I'd love to know more about how you leverage nutrition for your sport and what the evolution of nutrition in the sport of rock climbing has been like. I've never really heard of any nutritional philosophies from rock climbers, so I would love to know how big of a part that is.
Yeah, I mean, it's super crazy and also something we don't really understand, I would say. A lot of our knowledge for climbing comes directly from like other sports, so it's not like nutrition for climbing has been studied. I work with like nutritionists from like the USOPC, but I think a bigger challenge is that I have ulcerative colitis, which is a kind of like IBD, and with that condition, I'm not able to eat gluten or dairy and have to avoid certain kinds of like greasy food in general. I also don't eat red meat and like avoid basically all meat except for fish. So getting protein is definitely something that I feel like has been a focus point for me. I do focus probably the most on getting enough protein, and especially like when I'm lifting, like I think that's a key for me. But I would say, yeah, protein. I take like creatine during like the season and for most of the year. Apart from that, I think that, yeah, just getting like a well balanced diet, getting a lot of colors for limiting like inflammation is really important. But yeah, I would say in general, like I think there's been kind of a conception that to like climb you have to be like super light, and I think that a lot of people are starting to kind of challenge that philosophy. Of course it can be helpful, but I don't think that it's necessary by any means to like cut or be super light to progress in the sport.
Thank you for sharing, man. And if you don't mind me asking, I understand the removal of gluten due to the allergy, but how come avoiding all meat besides fish?
Yeah, it was mostly an environmental decision. Just like I think that for me, it seemed like one of the biggest ways to cut down on like my personal like carbon footprint. So that's, yeah, that was just something I did in high school, and I don't feel like it affected me too much. I felt like I could get enough protein from other sources. And I don't feel like I lost that in any way. Like definitely I've taken like a bunch of like vitamin tests and all that good stuff. So it just felt like a small way that I could do my part, I guess.
Hell yeah, man. Selfishly, I'm got more curiosities about this topic.
Yeah.
I'm a meat eater, but I help people with their nutrition, with their health, fitness, weight loss, everything.
Very cool.
And oftentimes I come across individuals who are in a similar boat to you for their own personal reasons that do not consume meat. And I've never lived that lifestyle. So for the sake of those listeners and my clients, help educate me. Like, how do you get enough protein, and what sources do you pull it from?
Yeah, I think that was part of why I have kept fish in the mix as well, just because, well, one, like I think it has a lot of properties to reduce inflammation too. But yeah, I think it helps me get enough protein as well. I think I aim for about like 130 grams a day. Do I get there every day? Probably not. Definitely not perfect. But for me, like supplementing with like protein bars and protein shakes is important. Making like a protein smoothie and just kind of trying to like think about it throughout the day. My like nutritionist recommends thinking or like doing it or doing like 20 or 30 grams like every 3 to 4 hours. And that's kind of like what I aim for. But I think supplementing is definitely important when you're trying to like keep up that amount of protein.
Hell yeah, man. Is it challenging to have fish regularly? Like when you travel, are you eating a lot from restaurants? I want to be a fish eater myself. I'm just not a great cook, and it's the preparation that gets me. So what's your secret to prepping seafood and having that on the regular?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I just have a couple of go-tos. So love like lox and just like throwing that in with a couple eggs like in the morning. If I'm in Japan, it's like pretty easy to get some fish. So lucky to have a couple of competitions there throughout the season. And then in Europe, even like I think that whether it be like having more lox or like canned like tuna even or canned salmon, it is pretty like chill. I feel like to get groceries in that range. Or when I'm going to like a restaurant, like usually they have like like this grilled fish like on the menu. So I think it's like actually pretty easy for most of the places that I've traveled so far. I can't think off the top of my head of like ones I'm like there was just no fish on the menu and I couldn't get any protein while I was out. But when I travel, like I do carry a lot of extra like protein powder with me and will just have an extra shake if I feel like I wasn't able to get enough protein when I was like out at a restaurant or something similar. So hope that makes sense, but I feel like it is a challenge for sure sometimes.
100%. I'm going to pivot a little bit. Dude, Jesse, you're just always smiling, man. It's always so cool how I've literally this whole interview, you just got like, you're always smiling. You got like the most like infectious smile on your face. I've watched like so many of your interviews, so many of your videos where you're bouldering with other people. And this summer, I actually remember watching you on TV and when you come out to the crowd, you just got the biggest smile and you always like wave and you always look so like happy. I'm really curious, man, like at your level of training, are you always just super happy? And this is like a really interesting, weird question because I feel like a lot of people at local bouldering gym levels will go through these cycles where they're super pumped to boulder. And there'll also be times where like, okay, it's game time. I have to like get past this grade and I have to progress in this next 6 months. I have to do this thing. I have to do this. And like, I'm really curious at your level, man, how are you always so pumped up and always so happy to always get better and do these things and have that smile on your face and not really go through those? And I'd love to hear, when are those times where you're not really smiling? You're like, okay, it's game face time, but I would love to hear about just your general approach about just everything and taking everything so nicely.
Yeah. Thanks for that question. I think it is something that I feel like I have tried to embody for a lot of my life. When I was a kid, my coach brought upon me the idea that having fun is like kind of the most important thing in a competition. And it almost felt like if I wasn't having fun, then what was the point of doing this competition or, being present in my climbing? I think that for training, I definitely like, get into that like frustration mode and get into that like, fight mode. But I feel like when I'm in a competition and when I'm in a performance mindset, I really feel like I've like done everything I can to be in this moment and to be prepared in order to do my best. And the only thing I can do is try hard and have fun. And I think that kind of, yeah, having that smile on my face, like staying positive and staying happy when something goes wrong, it's a reminder that, okay, like I'm still here. I'm still able to have fun and do things outside of just this specific move or this specific climb. And oftentimes, like I feel like that, like one more move, that regrouping really helps to have be optimistic in those moments of uncomfortableness and uncertainty. So I think that like practicing that, like in training, I call it like optimistic training, is really important for me. Getting to think that something isn't possible, and then either through like driving it home and like continually trying it and seeing that I'm able to do it by the end of like a month session or maybe a week, maybe even longer, 3 months or 6 months. I think that progress and that perspective of, I've been doing this for like 20 years or so. And I think that we're constantly taking something that feels impossible and making it possible. And I think that you can't take something that's impossible and create something that is like doable by the end of that if you don't think of it in an optimistic way and think that these moves are going to feel easier, even if right now they're feeling like so hard and it feels impossible that this ever is going to happen. This move or the sequence is ever going to go down. So I think, just staying a little happy and staying a little focused on having fun is all I feel like I can do when I'm in an environment that I can't fully control.
100%, man. That's such a great way to look at things. I hope a lot of young athletes listening really took note of that, because that's like the most pinnacle role model thing that honestly everybody should be looking at. So that's awesome. And
appreciate that.
Definitely. And I'm really curious. I have a listener question that fits in really well here, where I'm curious how much and how important does visualizing matter in climbing? Whether, before meets, things like that, or you're visualizing success, maybe it's some form of like meditation, maybe it's literally before the climb when you're visualizing, where your hand's going to go and where your feet's going to go, what's your beta. I'd love to hear how important does visualizing matter.
Yeah, I would say it's super important. If you haven't seen a climbing competition before, the way it works is that we haven't seen any of the climbs before we try them, but we are given an observation period. So we'll come out to the climbs in a group, and together we'll kind of sequence the climbs one by one, or in this group, but like each climb one by one. So we'll be asking each other, oh, like in this sequence, do we put our right hand here or left hand here? Does our foot go on this hold or that hold? And we'll be mapping it out kind of in the air. So our hands will be in the air. Maybe we'll be like turning, or if there's like an upside down move, maybe we'll like be pretending to put our feet in the air. And I think that while we're doing that, like we're trying to kind of ingrain like what the motion looks like. And then when we go back into our isolation zone where we're not able to see the climbs at all, then we'll kind of like practice the same moves. And I think there's one thing to like, visualize just like being like meditative. And then there's another thing to kind of, really go through the sequences and kind of rehearse them with your body as well. And I think that level of visualization is also something that I've been starting to do more and more in my climbing. It's something that I think is quite helpful to be able to have your whole body kind of engaged in that process, because it is just one try that we have. And if we can be, 10% more efficient on each move because we've sort of pretended to practice it or think about it before the climb, then that's 10% more strength or endurance that we're going to have on the wall. So I think that, it's a super important process and something that I think any climber could learn from with practice.
That gives me goosebumps thinking about like that moment before you go out on the competition floor and you're amping yourself up, ready to execute. I love that feeling.
Yeah, it gives me goosebumps every time for sure. Super exciting.
So in your training, you have your strength training, you have your climbing. Is there anything in the middle? Is there any like climbing specific drills that you leverage to get that last little bit of finger tendon strength or specific skill drill? I got to imagine you must break it into its pieces.
Yeah, I would say hangboarding is something that I do in season. More like out of season, I'll do weighted hangs, and then more in season, I'll do like kind of repeaters. So that is just like, say you're on like a hangboard and I'm on like a 20 millimeter edge. I'll do like 7 seconds on, 3 seconds off for like 6 sets, and then repeat that about like 10 times or so. So I think like for me, it's kind of like going from, yeah, more like, okay, I'm like lifting things and carrying heavy weights to, okay, I'm just trying to keep my like fingers healthy so that while I'm in season, they don't fall apart. And I think that, yeah, that's kind of like the general structure. As far as like other things I do, I would say that I do have like dedicated training on the wall, but I would say that it's not very similar to lifting. It's more just like specific climbing training. So I hope that answers the question. Also, like pull-ups, I would say, is something that I like to do a lot. So like moving into more of like power pull-ups and yeah, more like power on the wall, I guess, is something that I like to do as I'm approaching the season and moving out of like a strength block.
For sure. And that definitely answered my question. It opened up a new one. You mentioned doing things to make sure your fingers don't fall apart during climbing season. I'd love to know injuries. Like, what injuries have you had, and what do you do to prevent injuries? I imagine that's got to be a big part when you're just beating down the same tendons over and over again.
For sure, for sure. I guess if you had asked me 6 months ago, I would have been happy to say that in my 20 years of climbing or so, I haven't had a finger injury. But 6 months ago, I did get my first finger injury, which was a flexor tendon strain. And yeah, it's definitely been a bummer. It's something that I've had to train through, like going into the games. And then I still kind of have it to this day. So I think that as far as finger injuries go, I think that doing the repeaters definitely has helped a lot. I think for newer climbers, though, I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing a lot of like fingerboarding, especially when you're just starting climbing. I think it's more important just to try to be in tune with your body and tell when something or a move is like getting too hard on your fingers. If your fingers are getting super tired, stop. Don't like, ramp up your training even more fast. So I think like similar to like lifting, it's like if your body is just super, super tired, like maybe don't increase your like load or your volume. But if you're feeling like, oh, this is getting like super, like a lot easier for me, that's when you can like kind of increase the volume or the load. And I think just naturally climbing at a steadily increasing level will help keep your fingers healthy. I think the reason why I've switched to doing more fingerboarding is one, like when I'm talking about like a 20 millimeter edge, not trying to brag, but I feel like for me, that's like pretty on the easier side of things. Whereas I think for like a newer climber, that's going to be a lot more challenging. So I think that, if you do feel like there's like a certain muscle or tendon or certain finger that's getting tired more and more, starting to think about like rehab drills for that specific thing is important for sure. I love doing like almost a half hour warm up off the wall these days, like whether it be like a yoga routine, mobility, and then like band work. So I think trying to fit at least like I would say 2 or 3 things into your climbing warm up that are like off the wall is definitely important to avoid injuries. But I would say, yeah, I wouldn't focus on like the finger strengthening on like a hangboard or something similar, because you're going to get that just from climbing.
100%. 100%. That makes a lot of sense. I would love to hear, how many days a week do you climb? And do you have a kind of set, maybe like, I know you have different cycles, in season, out of season, things like that, but I'd love to hear on average, like, do you have a type of routines where, on Mondays, Tuesdays, Fridays, I do these type of things. I focus on these type of things on these other days in off season. I'd love to hear about that. And also love to hear how many days you climb just in general.
Yeah. So I would say like kind of when I'm out of season, I typically do 2 on, 1 off, 3 on, 1 off, or I'll do just 2 on, 1 off, 2 on, 1 off, repeating. The 2 on, 1 off, 3 on, 1 off is pretty helpful so that I can have like a consistent schedule. So if I'm like, I have Wednesday for meetings and Wednesday for hanging out, and Wednesdays and Sundays, I guess, consistently. But I think the 2 on, 1 off, 2 on, 1 off consistently is kind of when I feel sort of the best, just because I feel like it's the most consistent for my body. So sticking with a cycle like that, the way I'll sort of structure it will be my first day on will be a lot more power bouldering and really focusing on the hardest individual moves that I can do, followed by more power endurance. And then, so that'll be, say, doing like 30 moves 5 times that are like pretty challenging for myself. Or I'll do kind of like up, down, up. So I'll go up a challenging climb, down something easier, and then up something more like moderate. And most of the time when I'm doing both of those exercises, I'm falling most of the time. So it's not like I'm just doing things that I know I can do. It's like this move feels impossible for me, and but I'm gonna like continually try it and continually like learn from it and try to get a little bit closer. And then the second day, I'll focus a little bit more on both power endurance and endurance. So maybe I'll do some of those shorter circuits. We call them like circuits, like 30 move problems or so, mixed in with maybe like 45 or 60 move circuits where I'm getting more endurance based climbing in, but it's still super challenging for me. And I will say, like, a standard workout for me is doing about like 10 circuits of like 30 to 45 moves like in one session. And most of the time I don't finish any of those circuits. I'm falling on like all of them. So it is a lot of failure for sure. But I think the fun thing is that then if I'm on the same climbs for say 3 weeks, by the end of that 3 week period, I'm usually able to progress to the state where I'm able to do them. Maybe it's not every single time I get on it, but it's still pretty cool to see that progress over that kind of cycle. And I think that's why I would say, going back to the, if you're a newer climber, what would you do? If a climb feels really hard your first day on it, take a break. It's totally fine. But then maybe next time you're in the gym, get back on the same climb, or next week, get on the same climb, because I think you are going to learn. And even if you feel like you're not learning, I think your body will.
Definitely. That makes a lot of sense. And I'm really curious if we could put something out for like maybe the intermediate climber. So like maybe somebody who's climbed for maybe 2 to 3 years now, at like a regular beginner gym. And they climb maybe 3 times a week. I would love to hear, how would you think about structuring their days, their workouts? Maybe they climb Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and the rest of the weeks or rest of the days are like a lifting or some other sport. How would you think about structuring those days? And also, would you include any like hangboarding, kilter boarding, all of that stuff? And also, I know you mentioned, and we talked about earlier, the importance of climbing with intensity and climbing almost so you're always challenging yourself. I think a lot of intermediate climbers as well maybe struggle to find that point as well, because you're at that point where there's a lot of climbs you might fail just because of the skills and things like that. I would love to hear about that. I know it's a very loaded question, but maybe we could lay some very surface level frameworks. I would love to hear, how would you think about 3 days a week climbing and how to essentially improve with that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll start out by just saying, like, I think it's important to sort of question yourself as far as like why that failure is like uncomfortable for you and how you can kind of improve that over time. For me, and I think everyone, like, failure is just like challenging and not something that we want to see very much. But for climbing, it's pretty essential. I think it's about your mindset and trying to reframe it such that it's every time you fall isn't about a failure, it's about a learning opportunity. And I think that's something, of course, I struggle with, and of course, something that like isn't perfect in my climbing at all. Like, I get super frustrated as well, and I'm like, okay, I'm done with this thing. Like, I want to move on, and that's okay. But like I said before, like maybe coming back, whether it be another day or within an hour later, I think that is important. And also trying to think about these climbs like outside your session and trying to think about them when you're not on the wall and be like, okay, like now that I'm like outside of this experience, how can I learn from it? And what did I learn? Even if it kind of wasn't a fun experience, is important. I think that, if to go to your main question though, like as a newer climber, or like as an intermediate climber, and you're going to the gym, say 3 times a week, I think it depends, of course, on like what you're psyched on, whether it be like ropes, pushing your endurance, or trying to go outside for your first time, or if you have a specific objective. to keep it as broad as possible. And if you have a more like specific area that you want to focus on, happy to share more. But I do think variety is incredibly important just to make yourself the most well-rounded climber. So in my eyes, that would be maybe one day of doing a focus on like commercial boulders and trying to do some really challenging moves, individual moves for yourself. Another day, maybe doing more like volume on like a kilter board or system board. It could be volume in the gym as well if you don't have one of those boards as well. And I would say just thinking about like your on-site level and trying to push that as much as you can. So maybe trying 5 to 10 climbs that are within your on-site range and giving yourself like 3 tries and just making every single try count. And then the last day, maybe focusing a little bit more on endurance, maybe find a buddy, go climbing on a rope with them, or try to do like some of these like link ups like I was talking about before, where you're trying to link maybe 30 moves on a kilter board, which is super hard for an intermediate climber. So maybe that's like too much, but yeah, trying to get on a rope or do some kind of endurance based workout would be my general focus for a week.
100%. I love that. I think that's definitely going to get a lot of intermediate people really happy. I think you got them something to go home and think about. So I appreciate that. Now, I know you've climbed, dude, across the world, man. You've climbed so many different problems. I would love to hear, could you tell me about maybe an outdoor problem or something very unorthodox that you've climbed, or something that would get people who are not necessarily hardcore boulders that they may not know about? And I'd love to hear a story about one of the favorite routes you've climbed that's like that, a little unorthodox, not something you would see in a traditional gym.
I have like, so many stories. Like, would like a multi-pitch be good? Or like, would you want me to talk about like a rope climb that I felt successful on, or like an outdoor boulder that was like exciting for me to work on? I guess
let's talk about an outdoor boulder. I think that'd be, okay. I know you've climbed some really cool outdoor ones.
Yeah, for sure. I think the mecca of outdoor bouldering in my eyes still is probably Cape Town or Rocklands, which is in Cape Town, South Africa, or right around there. It basically is like a huge boulder field in somewhat of a desert where there are just like rocks for miles and miles as far as your eye can see. It's away from civilization, and every night like you see this beautiful canvas of like the Milky Way above you and like every star that you can imagine. And I think it's also a place where so many climbers from around the world kind of converge every summer. For me, like, yeah, it was just a super special experience to get to be there and experience that kind of rock. I would say one of my first like V14s that I ever did was called Book Club, and it took me about like 4 days of effort. It's like this beautiful crack climb, actually. You don't have to do much, if any, crack climbing in it, but you have to kind of, it's about like 15 moves, and you have to put your feet above your head at one point. You have to do a big throw at another point. And I think that when I first tried it, not all of the moves like went for me. They all felt super hard. But by the 4th day, kind of like what we were talking about before, like that impossible nature of the climb kind of slowly became possible. And when I did it, it still was like on the edge of what I felt was capable, or I was capable of. It didn't feel like it was a give me by any means. But I think that that's something that I love, especially outdoors, is when you don't know if something is like possible for you, but you're trying it anyway. And you're slowly making it become something that you can do. And maybe it's like there was a 25% chance that I was going to do it on that try. Maybe it was 50%. I don't know, but still having that like uncertainty and having to kind of like train your mind to be like, okay, that uncertainty is there, but I'm going to like do this thing anyway, is a really powerful feeling.
Dude, thank you for sharing. That sounds like a wild experience.
Yeah,
it's got to be really cool to be surrounded by other people traveling to have this specific experience. That must be a wild environment.
Yeah, and I also think what's special about climbing is like the elite level can do it right next to the beginner intermediate as well. And whether that be in a gym or in a place like Rocklands, like I think that happens a lot in like every area that you can think of around the country and around the world. And I think it's something that brings us together and makes the sport really special.
Hell yeah, that's really cool. I'd love to hear a little bit about life outside of rock climbing. What are your hobbies and passions outside of that? What else are you working on?
Yeah, a couple things there. One is that related to climbing, I'm on like the board of directors and a couple of like committees with USA Climbing. So trying to just make the sport a better place for the next generation. Next, I would say I do engineering work. I am just finishing up my role in the Harvard Biodesign Lab, which is based out of Boston. I work there full time in person for about 2 years, working on devices that help stroke patients kind of recover post stroke. And I continue to work there remotely while I've been in Salt Lake for the past 2 years. And now I'm kind of moving on. I'm interested in kind of like sports performance equipment. And yeah, kind of just trying to find myself honestly after the Olympics and trying to find that balance again. And yeah, I'm super excited. I graduated with a degree in mechanical engineering from Tufts, which is out of Boston as well. So yeah, keeping that engineering spirit alive where I can is important for me. I can't just think about climbing 24/7. So yeah, that's kind of what I've been up to. Also, like Utah is like great for like hiking and climbing outside as well. So trying to do that as much as I can.
That's awesome that you got that much going on, dude. And hearing you say trying to find myself after the games piqued, my curiosity of what's that like psychologically to prepare for something so in depth for 4 years, then execute. Like, what's the day after feel like? What's the psychological roller coaster that you go through being a games athlete?
Yeah, I definitely had like the Olympic blues, as some people call it, but I think it was even worse for me because of my finger injury. I had spent so long convincing myself that I didn't have an injury so that I could not think about it while I was climbing in the games that I actually didn't realize that I had an injury still when I finished the games. I felt it like while I was competing, but I just would ignore it. And I think realizing that that injury was still there and learning to retrust my body and my mind after kind of doing like psychological warfare was pretty challenging. And as you said, like I think it is an objective that I've had for so long. But in climbing, like I think for me, it was one day of competition. It's one hell of a special day of competition. And yeah, would be honored to ever have that experience again. But there's so much in climbing that I want to achieve. In other sports, like I feel as though it is the Olympics and that's it. But for climbing, as we talked about, there's like outdoor climbing, there's other competitions, there's just pushing yourself in a gym and giving back in all these different ways that I feel like these other facets of the sport make it so that you can make it a lifetime endeavor. And I guess my hope for after the Olympics was that I would be able to fully dive into outdoor climbing. And while I haven't been able to do that because of the finger injury yet, I still think that opportunity will be there. Other competitions are there for me next spring, doing like the World Cup circuit and World Championships next September. And then, yeah, I guess, dreaming about another 4 years when I feel healthy again will be really exciting for me too.
100%. It makes a lot of sense. And my mind just going back to when I actually said, when we talked about intermediate climber and I said 2 to 3 years, but I realized in 20 years, that's, compared to your 20-year climbing career, I don't know if you'd consider that intermediate anymore, huh?
Yeah.
Now, I would love to hear, you've climbed for such a long time, and there's a listener question here about what was your biggest obstacle and how'd you overcome it over those 20 years in climbing? If you could tell us a story about that to maybe somebody else who's trying to, either in their personal lives or in their climbing journey, trying to fight through something.
I would say being diagnosed with ulcerative colitis was probably the biggest challenge in my climbing that I've faced so far. With some caveats, like I think there are other times that were pretty challenging, but I'll go off of this one. So I was diagnosed in my freshman year of college. It was around finals period, and I was having a super stressful time, as most college students have during finals. But for me, my stomach was just like super upset all the time. And I was like, okay, like makes sense. It's just finals period. But then it didn't really go away after, a month or so. And it kept coming back stronger. So eventually I was diagnosed, and I feel like it really changed my relationship with the sport of climbing. Before, I felt like, I could get as stressed as I wanted, and, it could affect my performance, but really like I didn't think about it that much. And I think that having colitis, like the more I get stressed, directly leads to more symptoms. So I really had to find ways to adjust my lifestyle and truly my climbing in order to make room for this new disease that I had. And I think that for several competitions, I got overly stressed, even like lost some weight at times because of that, and didn't perform my best as well because my like stomach was too upset. So I think just like finding this sort of balance. Eventually, I've gotten like new medication as well, adjusted my diet as we talked about, and kind of found ways to really retrain my mind, whether that be doing like yoga or meditation practices, and being more in tune with like what's happening in my body has been a really powerful experience, both like on and off the wall. And yeah, it's still something I'm like struggling with today, truthfully, in one way or another. But I also think there were like a lot of great takeaways that I feel like I've like learned from over time.
100%, man. Thanks for sharing that. And I think the key to the pod is balance today. We got a lot of balance in today. And so last question before we get you out of here, I would love to hear what's next on the radar, the next year, next couple years, what's on your mind, and then where could people find you after this podcast?
Yeah, for sure. What's on my mind? Yeah, I think truly like rehabilitation is like the main focus, I would say. So I've been lucky to be able to be climbing still, and slowly seeing like a ramp up in my finger strength. And this is something I didn't fully mention about like weightlifting before, but unlike climbing, like I think weightlifting feels super addictive to me just because it's like, you're constantly like pushing more or able to feel like you're stronger like week to week, and seeing those gains in something tangible is something I don't often get in climbing. Maybe I'm like pushing a grade, but then like say I like do my first like V14 or whatever, then there are plenty of like V13s and V12s that also feel super challenging. Whereas weightlifting, like it's like, okay, like I lifted this amount of weight, I'm able to show that I've made like this progress. So for me with finger rehabilitation, I think that it's similarly addictive because I've been doing a lot of like weighted hangs and weighted pulls with my hand, and I can really see that kind of like progress. Like maybe not every week, but every 2 weeks or so. And I think that that is similarly addictive and gives me a lot of like hope for this process. And then as far as what's next, super excited to be outdoor climbing this winter, have some ideas of whether it be going to Spain or sticking around the States for some awesome climbs that I'm dreaming about for a long time. And then also the competition circuit will pick back up in the spring. And I'm hoping that I'm healthy enough and feeling fit enough to get back out there as well.
100%. Well, that's it for today. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for having me. This was a real pleasure.
Definitely. This was a blast. You were definitely the second list of climbers and a long list of climbers we're going to have on, but it was a pleasure chatting. Seriously. And your smile is seriously infectious, man. This is definitely like the most somebody's just come on the podcast and just been like super joyous like every second.
Oh, thanks so much.
All right.
You guys made it easy.